Well, it's a pleasure to be joined by a Brit. It's been a long time. Like I almost always talk to Americans these days, or Germans sometimes. So Tony, it's late, guys. It's late for both of us. All right, Tony's joining us from England, and we have a really interesting discussion. We already talked about 5 minutes before the show, and it's already like, okay, this is going to be an interesting one, and one that I think is really important, and that is the idea of nihilism in young men, especially, but also maybe a bit about the generations that precede us, millennials. So that would be Gen X, and maybe also about the one after us, that is Gen Z, and how kind of that idea or the problem, I suppose, also works with feminism, and I suppose how I think Tony would agree with me that how the world has become kind of feminine in so many ways, and how
Yeah.
you see that in culture, and you see it in the Catholic Church. And this is a really important thing, I think, in really most religions, actually, except for maybe Islam, which is why you strangely see that spreading its ways throughout Europe. So Tony, I guess I don't really know where you want to start, but I mean, maybe just give an idea, your basic idea of what we're talking about today, of the nihilism of young men.
Sure. Well, I suppose we will first want to agree on what you and I maybe think of when we think of that, right? I mean, tell me if you agree with this, but when I talk about the nihilism of young men, I see the increasing trend of not only men in the Gen X generation, not so much with the boomers. I think they had elements of it that were coming in because of their own cultural revolution, but I think they were too busy having fun to really care. So I think you start to see it more with Gen X, more again with the millennials, and I think it's been amplifying through the generations, this growing sense of nihilism and disconnect from things like meaning and culture and value and that kind of stuff. And I see it progressively affecting men more. And now, obviously, it affects women too, but I think it affects them in a different way and for different reasons. The dynamic is slightly different, although the causes are often the same. But at least from the male point of view, you see men becoming increasingly disconnected from not only society but their own sense of value itself, and they feel lost. You know, there's a great idea that a great sense of the young men feeling just lost in this world. And as we discussed just briefly before we came on, this idea that it seems to be polarizing more with the younger generations. You know, so if we look at Gen Z, or I think they even call it Generation Alpha now, that are coming after them, um, I see one of two extremes growing. You either see young men who completely embrace the liberalism as much as possible and go as far hedonistic and nihilist as you can imagine, fully eating it up, or they go completely the other way and basically want to start another crusade and go back into the Middle Ages.
So true.
So I think that's the phenomenon we see. I suppose we could talk about more to do with how that's come about and all other kinds of things.
Well, and I think it's interesting, as you said. So it seems like it is changing. I think that nihilism is kind of coming to an end. It's kind of going back, as you said. Well, one side is just saying we're going to be really crazy left. The other side is saying we're going to be really crazy, right. If that's, I mean, I don't know if that's the right terms, but I mean, so I guess you had a generation or two that kind of had this almost a shallowness and this searching for something, as you say. And I mean, I think you and I got to shout out your YouTube channel, because it has a lot to do with Sede which I think is also important to this. That's Catholic TVC on YouTube. So go check that out. Tony produces content mostly to do with Sede over there, as far as I know. And it's an interesting point, because I think that is how I connect. I mean, really, most problems of our modern times go back to the 1960s, right? And I think that the church is the foundation of all that is good and moral, right? It has to kind of guide the world, and it has for centuries, millennia. And I guess if you lose that guiding force, it kind of makes sense that the following generations are going to be kind of clueless, right? They're going to be pathless. They're not going to actually know what they need in life. And so I guess that's where I would start. I mean, it goes direct. The root of it is directly from Vatican II in the 1960s. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that.
I wouldn't say the root of it is there. I think Vatican II is caused by other things. I mean, obviously, you can go back to not only the fall of man, but the fall of Lucifer from heaven, if you want to. But you can go back, I think, also to the Enlightenment projects of relativizing philosophy. So I do focus a lot on sedevacantism as such, as I think it's the kind of head of the spear so to speak. But I also have done my own work on objectivist philosophy. Okay, in fact, my background was primarily in philosophy, and there's an audiobook on my channel, for example, called it's from my book called On Truth, which is a book directly against the idea of subjectivism and relativism.
Mm.
And another thing you as such, right? Because nihilism as such was gaining popularity along with things like existentialism prior to the Second Vatican Council. And these are just these ideas of, oh, there's no meaning anymore, right? Nietzsche's famous quote, that so-called, when he said God is dead, it's nonsense, but there's no meaning anymore. There's no objective value. There's no objective truth or anything. We're now just kind of floating around in the void, and we can just grab onto whatever we want to, whatever we invent. Okay. And that itself, I think, has those seeds were sown a few hundred years ago, and we're trying to reap those seeds. And particularly the young men now are kind of realizing how hollow of a world that creates if we actually try to apply those things as if they're actually true. But it's nonsense, The boomers had if I can just say this, the boomers had the luxury of positing these ideas without bringing them completely to fruition, because they still came from a culture that was greatly traditional, that birthed them, so to speak. But they started to experiment with all of this nonsense back in their day. But the generations that came after, X, millennials, etc., were actually trying to experience what that culture actually is like to live in, by those principles, kind of from birth. And I think that's why it's having a bigger impact on these generations.
That's interesting. I mean, so I guess it's always hard because you can, as you say, you can go back to the beginning of time, and I think you're
Yeah.
right with. I mean, Saint Pius X warned us about modernism, subjectivism, relativism, these things that were creeping in or had
Mhm.
already become part of society. I suppose not even creeping in. So I guess, I mean, then you saw it. I mean, I suppose after Pius X, you had the Great War, and then you had the kind of the roaring 20s, but they were really also very hedonistic. They were
Mhm.
very immoral generally, I think, in Europe and in America. Um, and then I suppose after that, then I guess you had the Second World War and the Depression, and I guess that brought people back to their senses, I suppose. And I guess that was then you had the Great Generation, as they call it in the US at least, and and then I guess the boomer. It is interesting. I think that's something that it's so fascinating to see how each built on the other. But I mean, what was it then? But why is it that you're saying that the boomers, it was kind of creeping, and why did it really hit with Gen X? What was it? What was the societal movement that started to turn men much more and more kind of pathless?
History isn't my forte. I mean, I learned enough about the culture of the 60s from doing my courses at university, but from what it looks like, for the boomers, it was a big experiment, right? And I mean, the whole culture then was a big experiment. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll was, yeah, things that they played with very lightly, relatively speaking, in the 20s and so forth. But
Hmm.
I think, firstly, you've got to remember those two wars made Europe and pretty much global culture punch drunk, right? They had just gone through the two largest wars in history, and all of the men died, right?
Yeah.
Well, most of the masculine men died. So you had all these kids and mothers, and the kids now had a free ticket to say, "Oh, let's try and reinvent society around this very so-called open, liberalistic, hedonistic culture." Right? If we're going to blame the traditions of the past for all of the suffering we had during those awful eras, then why don't we just go completely in the other direction? And that's when they discovered the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? And that's what they really enjoyed. And they had enough of a strong economy and
Mm.
things back then to actually do it as well, without having to really think of the repercussions. I've spoken to enough Gen X now to hear their complaints about things like being latchkey kids and that kind of thing, right? You had the boomers
Yeah.
as a generation who didn't really think of their responsibilities. They basically just
Right.
remained children, right, for a time. And they, in a sense, again, they had the luxury to do that. But
So what? Sorry.
I think,
What
yeah.
was it then that during this era? I suppose what shifted to make it so that the feminine kind of came on top? Women. I mean, because again, obviously there was a cultural and moral a shift
Okay.
towards away from
Mhm.
masculinity and towards the feminine. I think you see that in so much in society today. with the mistakes we make. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
we're going to get into that because I think a lot of men just blame it on women. It's obviously that's not true. That's kind of the point of what we're talking about. It's not just like, oh, the women did it. Well, why?
Absolutely.
Why did it? Why did the women have to start taking place in society? And I guess historically, I'd say it also started when the women had to go into the workforce during the world much more and more. I mean, even again, you could go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, I suppose. But obviously, you had these incremental
Yep.
changes. But what do you think? What was it then during this generation of, I guess, end of boomers, Gen X, that really started to shift the world away from masculinity and towards feminism?
I think it's all part and parcel of the same thing. The first thing I want to mention briefly is that men who blame it on the women are ironically being unmasculine by doing so.
Good point.
I think.
Yeah.
I think there's an element there of if you blame everything on the women, then that's not really a masculine thing to do. However, women also can't take that as we're just victims, leave us alone kind of thing. You know, everyone's got responsibility. But anyway, pass all that for now. I think it still ties into hedonism because with so-called women's liberation, we don't only focus on the free ticket that gave to women to kind of do things like joining the workforce and paying taxes. It also gave a free ticket to men to no longer have responsibility for women and families, right? So think about that. You had the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of things like Woodstock and the party generation, and the men were finally being told, despite everything that our ancestors were doing, you can now have things like no strings attached sexual relations and that kind of stuff. And the men thought, that sounds great. Why would we not enjoy that? Why would that not be a good thing? Right? From their point of view. But obviously, we now see the aftershock of that, and it's absolutely horrendous. But I think it's quite simple in that respect. Firstly, again, you had like a generation of masculine men, if I may say, kind of swept away or blown away by the war, with how amazingly tragic that was. Men that would have otherwise kept their rambunctious children kind of in check and tried to maybe put a lid on some of these awful desires. So that masculine kind of protection of morals was removed. And then you had a generation who said, oh, now we can just try to be free and it will be fun for all of us and we don't have to take responsibilities in the midst of that, men and women. So once you told the men, oh, you don't have to be responsible for your families anymore, they said, oh, great, sounds like a party to me. You know, I think that explains a lot of the
Well, and then the
behind it.
women, I mean, were the women just always waiting in the wings, just hoping that the men, why did they just so easily kind of slide into the positions of power? I think that's really interesting that when men started to be more like children, as you say, they started to be much more selfish and lacking the desires of what masculinity should be, which is, virtue in morality, why was it then? I guess someone had to run the world. I guess someone had to make decisions. Someone had to go to work, I suppose. And I guess the women just said, okay, then I guess it will be me. And I think it's interesting that it makes
You
everyone
see
upset.
it, Kevin, you see it even on a small scale, right? One of the best ways to understand feminism is to see a household that's actually run by a feminist. The first thing you see is that if the woman runs the house, she actually kind of resents the fact. Okay. And I had to really realize that even because I actually had a very liberal kind of upbringing and was surrounded by women who really spoke in favor of feminism. But it was very clear to me even then, even when I was fully sold on the liberal ideology, that those women did not like their husbands. They really didn't. And you notice that if a woman actually has to lead and she knows it, she's not happy about that. But she will do it if she has to. So I think that basically explains it. The men let go of their responsibilities and therefore women jumped into the vacuum because they couldn't rely on the men.
And it's just an incredible thing that you see it still today, obviously, that it really truly makes everyone miserable. And I mean, people always wonder, like, why are there, the divorce rates are obviously so high, but also mental health disorders, suicide, stress, even. I mean, these things are, I mean, again, I think you would agree with me. A lot of these have the root cause in people not having God in their life and not having the sacrament of confession, and I mean many different issues. But a big part of it too is you're totally right that if you switch the roles that God made us for, if you switch that and you say, okay, now the man's going to be subservient to the woman, that's not how we're made. Like we are hardwired. We are hardwired to be one way. And if you change that, typically because, as you say, the man is the one who's not fulfilling his duties and not rising to what he needs to be, then exactly as you said, the wife's going to be upset about it because she doesn't respect him. And it's a part of the marriage vows, right? To respect and honor and obey. And
Yeah.
okay, how are you going to respect and obey if the man's a little pansy? You know, I mean, it's true, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I had a very sobering and slightly tragic conversation with a family member about this not too long ago. I mean, my family's secular. The religion isn't even part of the conversation for them. But we were just talking about life as it strikes them. And let's just say there was a young woman in my family surrounded by the older women in the family who have all at some point been horrendously betrayed by men in their lives because basically those men didn't fulfill their roles, right? So I'm aware of all this, and I was listening to them give this young woman advice in life. Now, my advice would obviously be what we know to find God and to follow Him and to find a man that would support her and all that kind of stuff. But then it also struck me in the midst of, before I even said it, I thought, okay, so I'm going to tell this young woman to be her leader and her protector. And I knew what all three of those women were going to turn around to me and say. They were going to say, where,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
How would I do that? You're telling me to now bet my life on a masculine man to look after me and protect me and to be loyal to me. Like for some of these women, they've literally never
Mm.
met such a man, you know. And again, I don't think that's an excuse women can use to therefore not be feminine and to develop their own sense of their role in their person. Again, there's no excuses here, but they have a point in the sense that without the men there to allow them to be feminine or to completely fulfill their feminine role, they don't really have a framework to work within there, you know, which is true.
So why do you think that is changing with Gen Z? Well, why are men, at least in theory, I don't know how much we see of practice from this. I mean, Gen Z is still young, so it's hard to say if Gen Z is
Mhm.
truly going to put into action their beliefs of young men becoming actual men and leading their families and leading their wives and leading society. We'll see. I think we still have time to see, but I mean, even just the idea, as we said, you're kind of going off on two directions. What would be your idea? Why is that happening? Did it just reach a point where it went too far? We got to such a point where, again, I look at the Catholic Church, the Novus Ordo Church
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
so feminine. It's so feminine. Men are just like, no, I can't do that. I can't do
Yeah.
this. This can't be Catholic. I cannot go. And so anyone ever goes into Novus Ordo Church, and if anyone's in Europe, you have, because there's so many, there are these old churches that are, you go there to because it's a historical church, etc. And it's still obviously
Mhm.
owned by the Novus Ordo. You will so rarely see men. Rarely. I mean, and you'll see a
Mm,
bunch of
true.
old ladies and praying the rosary, or even if there's a mass, supposed mass, and you rarely see men. And it's because they've completely feminized it completely. And I think that's maybe they just went too far. I mean, what do you think?
Well, one thing I do see is that the younger men who come up aren't just looking for religion, they're looking for strong religion,
Yeah.
which is a hopeful sign. My own conversion had an element of that in it. I remember um, intellectually finding my way towards what you might call Christianity as such. I know Catholicism is Christianity, but you know what I mean. So I was ending up in places like Anglican churches and Protestant churches in the UK because the intellectual side of Christianity was making more and more sense. But even when I was standing in those churches, I thought this is so. I don't want to use a rude word, but let's just say it's quite soft. It's really really soft, and it's not for the stakes that are on the table here, like
Mm.
life and death and the salvation of our eternal souls. This is just so watered down and weak that it just doesn't speak to that fighting spirit that I think men hold in their hearts, whether you call it written on us by God or our ancestral DNA, whatever you want to say. But this idea of fighting for the good, the true, and the beautiful is not really reflected in these contexts. But I think men go looking for that now because it does still exist in stronger versions of religion. That's why you see a lot of them go over to the Eastern Orthodox, for example, because
Yeah.
to some extent they have actually kept some element of that.
Yeah.
Got to admit it, and that's why they go towards the Sede churches a lot more too. I mean, I don't know about you in the churches that you frequent, but when I see the congregations grow around Europe, in particular, young men are usually the demographic that are taking up the most space in a lot of these churches now.
I know I've met, I can't say it in Germany, unfortunately. Germany's slow. Germany's a little behind everybody, but I've traveled a bit through France,
Hmm.
and I'm just amazed as you go to these parishes in Paris, and I've been to a few others where it's really what you see. You really see
Yeah.
these young men who came to the faith through politics.
Yeah, a
That's
lot of
interesting.
them.
But
Hmm.
right, a lot of them, because they reasoned their way. They said, okay, our society, our politics, it's broken. It's broken. So
Hmm.
we need to fix it, and so they go and they search it, and they find, okay, what's wrong with our politics, and then they find the answer, and they say, okay, what's wrong with culture, and they find the answer, and they say, okay, what's wrong, and they eventually find their way into traditional Catholicism, which is incredible. It sounds like kind of similar to you. I mean, did you find that? I mean, where did you start? I know we didn't plan this being a conversion story, but
That's
it's
fine.
interesting.
Okay.
Where did you start with that? Did you start because you thought, okay, God exists and I want to learn more about him, or where was the
No, I started with just the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, and
Mhm.
the only reason why I mention that is because I did that in a context of philosophical chaos. My background was in, I say it was in philosophy, but I went to a modernist university. I mean, I studied in Brighton in the UK, which is about as left wing as left wing gets.
Okay.
My course supervisor was such an avowed Marxist that he had a life-sized, glorious poster of Lenin in the back of his office. Yeah, I would sit down looking at us as we were talking about my dissertation. Yeah, yeah. So that was my context.
Wow. Yeah,
Um,
that's pretty left.
I know. So yeah. So but I went to, I was always interested in philosophy because I was always interested in the idea of truth. But it was just when we went looking for it in modernized UK, you didn't go straight to people like Aquinas. You went instead to people like
Mhm.
Kant and Marx and all these other fellas, all these other figures. So, but I always held on to this idea that I know that 2 + 2 = 4. I know that truth is a thing. It's just this. I don't know where it is. This whole thing is like a big tempestual storm blowing all over the place and sending me in all kinds of different directions. And I actually used to hate religion because I thought the truth was that
Mhm.
religion was evil. Particularly Catholicism. All the awful things that
Yeah.
Catholics have done. But it was basically through, the long and the short of it is through holding on to that idea that there is such a thing as truth and there must be such a thing as meaning. I was able to kind of find my way further and further through the nonsense into something that actually made sense.
Interesting.
And here we
Well,
are.
and so, I mean, and
Yeah.
it's interesting because it kind of brings us back to that idea of nihilism coming partly through, the subjectivism, through, okay, if there's not one truth, if there's not objectivity, if there's not, hey, this is what is,
Hmm.
then everyone and that's kind of the crazy thing that and you see it in news stories or culture or whatever, if everyone has their own opinion and it can be just as true as the other person's opinion, it's like, well, but wait, no, I mean, how does
Yeah.
that, and you can see how on earth can people survive in a life like that? I mean, it makes sense.
Like that.
Yeah, yeah,
How can you fight for a belief
yeah.
that is only just as true as the other guy down the road who holds it for no reason whatsoever? Right. So why would a young man put his fire into that, right? Why would he live and strive for that and sacrifice for it? And why would he be masculine for it? You know. And I think again, the young men recognize that they recognize there's this huge lacuna in the culture and also in their spirits because there's nothing for
Hmm.
them to connect to. Yeah. There's nothing for their fighting
That's a
spirit
great
to
point,
connect
and
to.
and it's interesting. I think that's something you saw a cultural shift maybe 10 years ago now already with, I mean, I think Jordan Peterson was kind of the
Mhm,
tip of that spear, kind of the idea of, go
mhm,
and clean your room, just put responsibility onto your shoulders. And I think especially back in the day when he really first came into the scene, I think he was a great voice for that, because I think he just very simply told young men how to start to be masculine. And that is, put it on your shoulders, go and say, hey, I'm going to take more rather than less. And I think that maybe that was a part of where we started to see the shift in Gen Z. I think that slow shift was about 10 years ago. And I think he was a big part of that changing the idea of what actually makes men happy. And I think it's a pretty interesting turning point.
I think I agree, but I would phrase it differently or I'd frame it differently. I don't think he I think he almost anticipated. I also think the people he was working with anticipated that men were going to have that hunger, and I think they employed Peterson to kind of play the Pied Piper to
Makes
those young
sense.
men. Peterson is a Gnostic and basically a warped kind
Yeah,
of
it's
wizard,
true.
so to speak. If you actually look at what he believes, he's not a Catholic. His ideas are not
Yeah.
compatible with Catholicism, and I don't think he's on our team. Frankly, he's a globalist as well, which doesn't help. And I think what Peterson was set up to do was basically say, look, we know that young men are going to have this hunger for something to do with responsibility and masculinity. So how about you, Peterson? Instead of them going towards Catholicism and that kind of stuff, how about you come along and use words like Christianity and God and stuff and take them somewhere else,
Interesting.
please,
I could
for a
see
little
that.
while.
But
And I think he
but then
did
I guess
that.
that's the
I
question.
think
Then
he did that.
how did he or whoever, how did they know? What was the sign that men were going to start to change? I mean, was it again they just saw they hit the wall? You know, it's like we can't take this any farther in terms of turning things feminine and
Yeah, well, Peterson came along. Don't forget the milieu that he was in. I remember quite clearly that he became popular. We had the growing cultural Marxism and liberalism, right? It started to engender things
Mhm.
like the transgenderism and that kind of stuff. We also had the four atheists. You remember Dawkins, Harris, Dennett, who have kind of disappeared now for
True.
some reason as well, which is kind of weird. Yeah, it's interesting. Do you ever hear about Richard
No,
Dawkins anymore?
no, true. Good point.
No, they've kind of
Yeah.
evaporated. Yeah, but in those days they were a big deal, you know, and there was a big cultural conversations about stuff like God, religion, but also about things like liberalism, free speech. And I remember Peterson hitting the ground running right in the midst of this
Yeah.
transgenderism stuff, if you
Yeah.
remember. And I think that's because that's when they realized that liberalism had kind of reached its
Yeah.
insane apogee. Yeah. Like we've got to the point where we're telling everyone that men are women. And not only that we think that's an opinion, but they actually like have to teach it at universities or they're going to go to
Crazy.
jail or something. Right. And so I think they knew, yeah, the moment we do that, men in particular, but culture in general are going to think, yeah, there's a few red flags here. And I think that's what they saw coming with the young men's, particularly the men's reaction to that.
That's interesting. I think that makes sense, and I guess you've seen that trickle down, and I think that Trump is another guy. Donald Trump is another guy who kind of has understood that he's understood better than most people how the
Mm.
society is changing and kind of the ebbs and flows of it. I think he just gets that. And I think that's why he's been elected twice, and I think he just understands better than most that you know the way he is. Is this kind of it's crude. I don't love the guy. But I think he's understood that
No.
that is what a lot of people want. They want someone to tell them the truth,
Mm.
even if it means they're going to be rude and crude and they're not moral. They don't really care. They just want someone to be masculine. I think, that's it. And
Exactly,
I
it's
think that's
masculine
what's so
energy.
interesting that
Yeah.
you see this is all kind of coming together. It's all leading to this like, well, this is why things are changing because there's a huge part of society, including women. We saw that in the vote, women also voted for Trump. Believe I was surprised by that. That I did not expect that. And
Well,
yeah,
women
that's
like
it.
masculinity,
Yeah.
man.
Yes.
They actually do. No matter how much they speak against it, no, women do actually like masculinity, and men like
Yeah.
femininity. You know, and then women like masculinity and leadership. I mean, that's just nature. You know, so it's no surprise to me. I mean, the unfortunate thing though is because we're again the beauty of Catholicism. One of the reasons why it's the true religion is because it's the religion that holds all of the virtues and the human qualities in balance. You know, it has masculinity forged and tempered with proper
Exactly.
virtue, humility, justice, responsibility, and that kind of thing. But unfortunately, I think you see with characters, we take
I was
Andrew
just
Tate, for
gonna
example,
say,
right?
yep,
He was like,
exactly. Yep,
yeah, he was like a cartoonist rendition of what
exactly.
masculinity
Yep,
is supposed to be. But it's an ugly, distorted, horrible version of masculinity. Like you absolutely should not emulate
right.
someone like Andrew Tate. I mean, he was basically a
Yeah,
pimp and a pornographer. He
yeah,
was like he was objectively both of those things
yeah,
and more, right? So, but that's the thing. Like, there's again, these people play this game very, very cleverly. They know that there's going to be this emerging hunger for masculinity. So they say, okay, we need to feed that hunger. Who can we use to feed it? Shall we use our Lord Jesus Christ? No, 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 because he's the enemy. Let's take someone like Andrew Tate instead, because the flavor of masculinity he's going to feed these people is still going to make them
exactly.
worse in some way. You
Yeah,
see,
and
so
I
that's
think
how
you're
women
totally
play.
right. And so they're trying to keep you away from virtue, really. But also, I think they're trying to more and
Mm,
more. They I think they want chaos, that they want divide, they want to split, they want racism, right? They want us all fighting over these different ideologies. And so exactly, they want any man who wants to be masculine, you got to think you got to go and get absolutely ripped, and you got to womanize, and all these different things that are, as you said, they're totally horrible and immoral and not
yeah,
manly, because manliness is
no,
virtue. I mean, and I think that you're exactly right.
hmm,
And I think they have the double purpose, and they also want to just, they want us fighting. They want us, at each other's throats, partly so that we just don't pay attention to what they're doing, behind the curtain, whatever that is,
yeah,
and ruining,
exactly,
ruining our
yeah,
souls. And I mean, that's the devil's ultimate objective. So whatever you want to believe in, the people behind the curtain, we know for sure that the one
hmm,
eventually behind them is the devil, right? We know the devil is, his entire purpose
exactly,
is to lead everyone to hell. And if that's the case, then you know that he is trying to turn society, trying to turn families, away from each other. He's trying to get kids out of the home. He wants to get children into daycare as early as possible. He wants women in the workforce. He wants
hmm,
men to be video game addicts and porn addicts and all these things. And you see that, I mean,
exactly.
in the modern world, it's hard to be virtuous.
Absolutely. I mean, it's it's how he plays his game. It's how he's always done it. I mean, one of his favorite tactics is to set up a false binary, two extreme
Yeah.
binaries, right? So basically, you can either be a male feminist eating soy all day and gawping at everything that you see, or you can become like a super dictator, and your entire idea of masculinity is just oppressing and crushing everyone you see because that's super masculine, bro, right? But that's how the devil presents it, right? It's like option A, option B. There's no third choice. You've got to just choose one because they're both evil, right? And that's how he loves to play it. And yeah, and in the sense of dividing us, I mean, the very idea that there's even a war between the sexes is one of his, in that sense, one of his greatest
Yeah.
achievements. You know, he split humanity right down the middle and say, okay, men and women, you guys are now in competition with each other, which is a crazy invention of feminism. And one of the reasons why feminism is objectively the
Yeah.
hatred of women, right? It's put women in competition with men, which is the last place they should
So
be.
true. Right.
Yeah.
And so, right, in our modern society, exactly, they're supposed to be quote unquote equal. They're on the same plane. So, which means men should treat them like they treat men, and men treat each other terribly.
Also
So it's like, so
rely.
you want us to treat you
Yeah.
terribly. You want us to, I mean, that's just how it is. It's like,
Yeah.
so you want me to punch you in the face? I mean, that's how you put them on this level where women should be on a pedestal. They
Exactly.
should be in many ways
Yeah.
above us. Again, not exactly. I mean, men should lead, but women should be in this ideal. They should be what we hold, what we're, why do we go to war? To defend, we defend our home, our women, our children, our countries. And that's the whole, I mean, again, if you're defending, guys, not attacking, but anyway, and I think that's exactly it. And it's exactly what they've turned. And the devil is just, he's done it brilliantly, because again, you got them at the same time. You got men to be lazy, you got men to be, nihilistic, and you got women to fill that role and to think that's what they want. And as you said it just right. That's, and now they get to a certain point in their lives and like, I'm miserable. I don't like my life. I don't like anyone in it. And they're divorced 3 times. Like, well, I wonder why.
Yeah.
It's because, well, your roles reversed.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and also they taught the women to, well, the women and the men to
Yeah.
chase heathenism
Yeah.
above all else as well. I mean, women are just as fallen as men and make plenty of mistakes and do plenty of evil. And one of the things they also try to do is monopolize on the situation to try and maximize what they think is their own pleasure, their own money, their own wealth, their own happiness. They don't take their own responsibility, for example,
Absolutely.
for having families and being the nurturers of that and that kind of thing. And that by itself creates its own type of poison. So it's bad from both sides. It really is. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I guess then the question is that, I guess we have to ask ourselves, I mean, how do we fix this? And if men are and women too, I think are trying to head back towards tradition, which I think they are, which is why we have 2 podcast channels. Why we're trying to teach. You have one as well. We're trying to
So,
teach truth, to show that there is objective truth. And my recommendation. This is kind of funny. I've been reading to my children a children's Bible, and it's even in German. So it's kind of hard for me because my German is not great. Should be better. But anyway, I've been reading a children's Bible, and it's just amazing how much clearer you can think when you start reading the New Testament. Just like try because we all go to church and we hear from the Bible all the time, and you hear these phrases, you hear the paragraphs. But if you go and just read the Bible through, and you're explaining to children especially, it really makes you really have to think about what is happening, what is Christ doing, why did he do this. And I tell you that it'll make you really, that will fix you. I really think that's the whole
Well,
point.
not
It
just
will
what he
it will
does.
help you
Yeah,
become a better person. And I think that's again the idea of how do you become masculine? Well, you need masculine people to look up to, but you also need something to fight for. I think you
absolutely.
said it before.
hmm I would say, yeah, absolutely, hit the nail on the head. I mean, the first answer I was going to give the moment you mentioned the solution was basically following decent role models. So obviously, the first and most perfect role model is our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and it's not just because of what he does or what he did during his life on earth, but how he did it. I mean, one of the things that you can point out about our Lord's life is that he was meek and humble and mild and gentle, but he was never timid,
Yeah.
ever. He was always completely straightforward.
Look how he handled the Pharisees.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
He always looked death, for example, straight in the face, and he always led. He led really from the front in every single thing he did. But he led to serve, and I think that's one of the first paradoxes that men need to consider when they consider being masculine. Every man needs to be a leader at some level. You're either going to be a leader of a group of other men in some capacity, or you're at least going to be the leader of your household, which you should be. But leadership is a form of servitude, and that's the difference between a leader and a tyrant. A tyrant leads to serve himself, and a true leader, leads to serve really the good of his company. And so long as you have that sacrificial idea in mind, I think that's the first anchor point to understanding the real masculine role of a leader. And our Lord is the perfect example of that. Second from that, I think it's very, any of us who have had it are blessed to at least have met one or two genuinely masculine figures in our life. I can say from personal experience that I wasn't raised with much, if you would say, masculine models to follow. But I met enough masculine men in enough context to have at least some idea of how to be and to maybe emulate that. And so, on another practical level, we should be those examples ourselves if we can be to
That's
the
it.
young men around us. Absolutely. We should always continue learning and continue practicing and continue taking on more responsibility and exercising that responsibility. But to the best of our ability, if we can also, be an example to those around us, that I think that would also do a lot of work. For sure.
Yeah, and I think I couldn't agree more. And I think that's, and to be very active in it. I mean, I think that
Mm.
especially if you're older, I mean, I'm pushing 40 these days, which is crazy. But I mean, there are other men who are, 50, 60, these other generations who have gone through a lot, and they've had to become manly because of trial and error, probably a lot of them. And
Yeah.
I think we need it. You said, I mean, starting with ourselves. If you're in a, let's say, parish or anywhere, I mean, there's always some young people who are struggling. But, find a young man who looks like, he needs a mentor. So many young men just need, exactly as you said, they need a mentor, even if they have good dads. Sometimes you need an outside
Yeah.
mentor. Just, you don't have to tell them the entire, you don't have to give them every answer to every question in life, but give them someone like, hey, I'm there. If you need anything, you can come to me. We'll go drink a beer together and chat it through, because I think men need that. And I think you're exactly right. And another one of my tips for an active way is to do hard things together. Do it, get a group of men and climb
Yes.
a mountain, build a house,
hmm
clean the church.
hmm
I mean, again, whatever it is. I mean, okay, clean the church doesn't sound manly, but it is, because it's a duty, right? I mean, I think that's
Martial
the thing,
arts,
that, man, to do
go and
these
get punched
things
in the face.
together as men, I can tell you're going to grow closer together, and you're going to feel better after it. You're going to, and I preach all the time on this channel about the pilgrimage in September, which you should come to, by the way, Tony. Here near Munich,
Where's that going
in
to be?
September near
Oh, in
Munich. Yeah.
Munich. Okay.
You
Might be
should.
possible.
It's
Yeah.
awesome. It's a
Okay. We
great
can
group
talk
of
about it
people.
later.
And it's a way that you can do it together. You're carrying a statue of Our Lady for a couple days, and you hurt, and it's hard, and and
Awesome.
it's such a good way to grow. And women can come too. So it's not just for men, but I mean, it's a good way to do masculine things. But I think that's, as you say, serve, go and say, you're gonna find yourself so much happier and more fulfilled if you're going out of your way to help others. And it sounds cliche. It's like, yeah, my mom told me that. It's true. It's true. She
She
knows.
was
Yeah,
right.
it's true. It's just simply true.
Yeah, she was right. Absolutely. Um, yeah, and again, it's that inner hunger I think that men particularly have. That idea they want to fight and strive for something. I know you said earlier, for example, that women should be on some kind of pedestal. I wouldn't agree, just because again, the word phrasing I think is a bit tainted in this day and age. They're not super special and without
Yeah.
fault and all that kind of thing. I've met women, and they're not perfect.
I'm married, and she's
And all of
close.
the honest ones, all of the other ones know it.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. All of the honest ones know it. But it's fine. We love them. We love them because
Right.
they are women. You know, and in a sense, it's actually their vulnerability and their weakness that makes us want to not pedestalize them, but protect them. To look after them, to also nurture them in our own way. And there's a real beauty that comes from the fragility of women and the children they bear and nurture, and the very beautiful fact that that's obviously new life they're bringing into the world as well. It's profoundly a profoundly beautiful thing they do. And so men have that inner desire to say, yeah, I want to fight for that. Yeah, I want to do something good so there can be more of that. You know, and that's why I think men need to find that project, that something they can get behind, where they can find some way to contribute to that, and not just contribute to their own wealth or money or how many saving up for the next holiday so they can chill out in Barbados for a week or two. They just know that there's nothing in that to
Yeah.
get things going, so to speak. To really wake them up and make them feel alive.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And I think part of it is understanding the problem, which hopefully maybe this little chat has made people think about it a little bit. That's interesting. It comes from, a long time, along many years of problems and issues that were, again, foreseen by popes and happening.
Mhm.
And I think that should, I don't know, it should give us a little bit of hope. I think that we can get out of this. I think we are getting out of this, and then maybe we, or the ones after us, are the generations that are going to turn things around, and hopefully in the church as well. I mean, I think that's, and I think we also, as men, I think we need to stop complaining so much and stop, oh, the church is, yeah, I know it is bad, but okay, what are we doing about it? I mean, are we building a church
I have
here?
almost
I mean,
no
look, our
tolerance.
ancestors, they're like, hey, you know what?
Yeah.
For goodness sake, these people would. This is an incredible thing. You go like through Kansas, so middle of nowhere in America, and it's the same in England, of course, and I mean in here too. But I mean, in the U.S., it's interesting because it's not a Catholic country. But you go through the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's a huge in Kansas, and there's this huge cathedral. Huge. It's called the Cathedral of the Plains, and it's a big cathedral. It's like one you've seen in London or Munich, and it's in the middle of nowhere. And it was
Mm.
just, there were simply these German immigrants who moved here, and they had this little town, and they just spent generations
Yeah.
building a cathedral because it mattered. They're like, hey, we're just going to do it. We need a church, and we're going to build a really big one.
Mhm.
And that's just that ambition, and
Yeah.
that's manliness. That's like, hey, we're not just going to build a little church. We're going to build a cathedral. Oh, I love that. We need to think like that. We need to
Exactly.
think big. We need to think. And I think we're in an era of that, where
Oh,
we can start to think bigger rather than just being like, oh, we're little, we're Sede Vacantis. No, we're Catholic. Knock it
yeah.
off.
No,
Come
we're
on. Let's
Catholic.
be Catholic.
Yeah.
Let's where's Christendom? If we're not, who else is going to do it but us or our children? And that's the fight.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, just from that story you told, I do want to mention briefly that I recently read a book about the Siege of
I'm
Malta,
reading a book.
and we can
Anyways, sorry, go
complain.
ahead.
There's all kinds of reasons why we complain about how difficult life is today. But I remember just reading one section in there where it's and the knights inside the castle were in their third month of the siege, and they were wearing 200-pound suits of steel armor over leather jerkins in something like 50-degree heat. And you read something like that, and you think, it really isn't that bad. It really could be a lot worse.
So true.
But I agree, and I think one other thing I'd mention here, just before we end, is what very simply the very first thing men should do is they should connect with other men.
Yeah.
That's huge for men.
Yeah.
I know connecting is big for women too, but I think it's particularly important for men because we do group up psychologically. You know, we form tribes or units or platoons or whatever. We just have that in us. It's one thing for a man to be alone. It's a completely different thing for a man to be working together with just one other man.
Yeah.
And if you multiply that, if you make it groups or teams or whatever, entire congregations, that's a whole different thing. So if nothing else, if you want something very, very simple to start off with, I'd say to young men, just find other men to connect with and start working from there.
Couldn't agree more. No, I'm totally with you, and hopefully you guys can find that in your own parish. And again, older
Mhm.
men find these younger men who need that, and take it upon yourself to do it. To say, hey, I'm not going to wait for someone else. I'm going to say, hey, buddy, you want to go, and I think it's important to have men's meetings. We do that here. I know some places in the US
Yeah.
they do, twice a year, a couple times a year, they do men's meetings where you talk about a
Mhm.
certain topic. We've talked about Bitcoin, for goodness sake. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
I think people think about these things, they hear this like, oh, men's meetings. So are we going to get together and kneel and pray the whole time? And part of it's prayer, of course.
Yeah, of
We
course.
start with
Yeah,
mass,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but yeah, you also talking about things that are interesting and topical, and could affect you, and it's a valuable time. I think you're 100% right. And I'll say, if anyone's interested, I have not at all talked to Tony about this. I don't know if he'd be interested, but well, I will. Maybe we can start a Telegram channel if anyone's interested. Any guys out there want to have a little chat, throw out ideas, ideas for growth, ideas of how do we be virtuous men, maybe books. Maybe we'll start a Telegram channel, open one. If you want to join that, I don't know if Tony can say if he wants to join it too. I don't know. I'm literally
No,
throwing
I'll
it
be
out
happy
right
to.
now.
I mean, I already
That'd be
am
cool.
part of a few Telegram channels. I don't run any. Well, I do technically run a couple of my own, but I've been in Catholic Telegram
Sure.
channels, and the cool thing about that is they're a very easy and quick way to connect men who even live on different parts of the world. I think one of the
Right.
groups I'm in, for example, has men from like 5 or 6 different countries in it. But we're in constant feedback with each other, and it's a
Yeah.
constant kind of touching stone, a constant source of support, or just interesting stuff. Might cause a few debates and arguments as well because men like a good debate.
Which is
You know,
good.
yeah, absolutely, it's
If you
healthy.
keep it under control, I think that's another thing. I mean, we really do have to end this fairly soon,
Sure,
but
sure,
it's
sure,
interesting
sure.
because I
Uh,
think it's true. It's something we've lost in our era, in our time, that we are not able to disagree with each other, right?
no,
Either we're just too like, oh, I'm not going to say anything, or hey, you dirty, you get too emotional about it. It's like, hey, we can disagree. Like you've disagreed with me a couple of times. It's like, hey, I actually appreciate
no,
how you corrected things I said. That's okay. I think that's an okay thing to do, and we can disagree about whatever politics or I mean, okay, the faith, you got to be careful, of course, but I mean, other things, there's so many things you can disagree with, and I think we need to learn that again. I think we need to learn how to have debates that are not out of control. And maybe that's another thing. Maybe we can do that on a Telegram channel. If anyone wants to join, let me know. You can email me, Kevin89Davis@gmail.com. Comment
it's actually,
here. We'll add
yeah.
you.
It's something that I'm developing as part of my own. I work as a teacher, and I know I'll end on this, but it's just because it's on point. I run these things called apologetics. I call them sparring sessions for apologetics, and they have been given the green light by my priest. So it's part of my own, my own work. But he has said, look, I agree with what Tony's doing here, and the idea is basically to put men particularly into situations where they have to uncomfortably disagree with each other. Instead of it just being like apologetics lectures, we play it kind of like this. I'll come into the room and say, all right, John, you're going to pretend to be a Muslim, okay? And Gary here you just learned that he's a traditional Catholic. So John, by being a Muslim, tell Gary, yeah,
Hmm.
and he'll have to
Interesting.
play that role, and it will become semi-heated or whatever, and we all kind of sit there and watch, and then maybe either side says, well, I don't really know how to argue this. Like, how would I respond to this? Like, if I was a Muslim, what would I say? Or if I was a Catholic responding to this, what would the response be? And then we can all jump in and talk about how we would deal with it. But it's still a way of
Interesting.
putting men on the spot. It's a way of saying, look, you're gonna probably look like an idiot in some of these situations, but that's
Yeah.
fine. Don't worry about it. It's cool. Just
Yeah.
roll with the punches, and we'll build each other from here as a kind of sparring session would.
Cool. Well, it shows you that you first of all need to learn the basics, right? I think that's
Uh,
typically people aren't asking you, what's the thesis, right? I don't know. I'm sure you
yeah,
know that
yeah,
was like, that's typically not. If
yeah,
you're going to meet someone at the pizza shop down the corner, they're going to ask you the most common question I get is what is that? What's
yeah,
the scapular? Why are you
exactly.
wearing what is that? And that's one, okay, that's the one that I bet you most people get, right? And it's because it's the act of things, or making the sign of the cross. Okay, why did you do that? Why are you not eating meat on Friday? I had that a couple months ago. And those are the types of things that, because people can actually see it, they're going to ask the most. So I think that's, and I think your idea is awesome. And I think that it's exactly what we need. I think we need practice. You need to think about these things. Okay, what is my answer? What do I know about my faith? And it's, again, I tell you, when you have kids and you start having to tell your kids answers about, like, what was it? My daughter had one the other day. She's like, she just turned 5, and she said, what'd she say? Why did Jesus pick Judas to be an apostle if he knew he was going to betray him? And I'm like, oh,
good question.
Man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it's a good question. But so I had to really consider it myself. Okay, why is that? But then I had to explain it to a 5-year-old. So it's two different things. So that's another thing. If anyone wants to learn their faith really well, talk to a 5-year-old, because they'll ask you tough questions, and then you have to explain it to a 5-year-old. Yeah. But anyway, and actually, speaking of that, you also are doing a curriculum. Or helping with a curriculum. Is that it? I guess not. You're not.
Yeah, let me explain that very briefly, because I know we're pushing time now.
I think maybe we'll even do a whole show on it, because I'm really interested in this topic. But maybe do a real brief.
Sure. So very briefly, I'm one of the few people, I think, on the internet who's made any material on what's called the Trivium education system, right? Which is basically the Catholic model. If you speak to any priest, they'll know about this. It's the Catholic or traditional model of learning that combines the 3 arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Okay, and most classic systems are built around using Trivium in some way. Now, I made a course on that for adults a few years ago, but ever since then, I had a couple of Catholic families here in the UK basically say, "Is there any way to kind of engender this in our children? Can we bring it to the kids?" And I had a few challenges to overcome there, because I had to make it extremely affordable. These guys don't have much money at all. So I had to find a way of making it affordable. I also wanted it to be an actual homeschooling thing. I wasn't going to come in as their lecturer and just micromanage these kids every step of the way. So it's been a great experience so far. We've been running the experiment now for about a year, and we've found ways of basically running this program alongside families. I basically take what you might call a support role. And we give lots of assignments and materials to the families for them to work with. So they basically learn Trivium as a family, with my assignments and things as touchstones and guidance, and for things for them to actually achieve and overcome.
Interesting.
And then I help on my end to basically make sure they're fulfilling all the assignments correctly, and they understand the concepts and stuff involved in, grammar, logical thinking, logical reasoning, rhetorical production of language, and that kind of stuff. So that's the overview. It's called the Home Trivium Program.
Home Trivium Program. Well, we will definitely have to have you on again to talk about that, because that's something that my wife and I are very interested in, and I know others as well. I think I firmly believe one of the biggest issues in our world is that we've forgotten how to teach. That I think that classical education is so superior to modern education. And again, we could talk about that for forever, because it is, but it's extremely important. And so I'm really interested. And let's talk soon. We'll do another podcast for that, because I think for sure that
sounds fantastic.
That could do a whole show, and maybe people let us know. I'll ask Tony. Maybe Tony could do it live. That would be an interesting one, because it would be good to get people's questions for that, maybe. But we'll see. Again, I'm throwing things on Tony as we go. But if not, maybe ask your questions here in the comment section if you have any questions for Tony for the upcoming show. I don't know when, but sometime we'll talk about that, because that's extremely interesting, and that sounds good. Sounds fascinating. Unfortunately, right now we live in a country where it's illegal to homeschool, but that's another thing. We pray that that could change. Politics, culture, it's moving in the right direction in Europe. God willing, it continues. It's baby steps. I know it's baby steps. Okay, England maybe not. England's a mess, but otherwise it's moving in the right direction. And
it really is.
Man, I don't know. I hope you don't get thrown in prison for this podcast. No. I mean, these days I don't even know. You said something against women. I don't know.
It's all part of the fun. Yeah. No, it's all part of the fun. It really is threading a needle, but I don't think we're here for things to be easy, are we? So.
If it was easy, then we'd have to kind of wonder about it. Something must be wrong. Awesome, Tony. I've really greatly enjoyed this. Thank you very much for coming on. And let's do it again. Let's do it again soon. We'll talk about the home trivium curriculum. Awesome, Tony. Until next time, everyone, please like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Let us know what you guys think. What do you think is the issue in society? Do you think men are headed in the right direction? How do you think men should be more masculine, and how can women be more feminine? What do you guys think? Let us know in the comment section. And if you have any comments or questions for Tony about the schooling, education, philosophy, whatever, hit us up. I'll make sure that Tony's watching. And again, go check out Tony's channel over at Catholic TVC on YouTube. I'm trying to throw it up on the screen, but everything's just gonna have to remember it. Catholic TV on YouTube. Guys, until next time, Tony, God bless you.
God bless.